Zen Buddhism by the numbers, number 7, the 7-piece robe. First piece. Siddhartha Gautama emerged from his mother's side as she stood leaning against a tree in a painless and pure birth. He took 7 steps to the north, 7 steps to the south, 7 steps to the east, and 7 steps to the west. A lotus flower sprang up in each of his footsteps. Pointing one hand to heaven and the other to the earth, he exclaimed, "I alone am the world-honored one." A wise man, hearing about this, predicted, "That boy's got quite a future." Second piece. 7 days after Buddha was born, his mother, Queen Maya, died. Third piece. Siddhartha sat under the Bodhi tree for 7 days and 7 nights without moving. On the morning of the 8th day, he saw the morning star, and all his striving ceased. No longer Siddhartha, now Shakyamuni Buddha, he exclaimed, "How wonderful! I and all beings together are fully awakened." Fourth piece. For 7 weeks after his awakening, Buddha continued to meditate under the Bodhi tree until he had a vision of Brahma Sahampati, king of the Brahma gods, who told him to get off his butt and teach. He met 5 of his old ascetic friends in Deer Park near Varanasi and delivered his first sermon, describing the 4 noble truths in the middle way. They all became disciples, and one of them, Khandana, was enlightened just by hearing him speak. Fifth piece. 7 days in a week, 7 weeks in the cycle of transition after death. Sixth piece. Fall 7 times, get up 8. Nanakarobi Yaoki, old Japanese saying. The 7th piece. Uman said, "The world is vast and wide. Why do you put on your 7-piece robe at the sound of the bell?" Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I can say that now because it's the middle day. We'll get into numbers and middle days and all that stuff later in the talk. How many people here either grew up watching Sesame Street or had kids who grew up watching Sesame Street? Probably a lot of us, right? Yeah. So this talk is brought to you by the number 7. When I was making up this list of Zen Buddhism by the numbers, I couldn't find much on the number 7. I looked at the numerological significance, and in numerology, it's considered the number of perfection, of completion, of introspection, spiritual awakening, all kinds of good things. And then I noticed that the number kept popping up in various Buddhist stories. Not only Buddhist stories, but all kinds of religious stories. And Judaism and the Kabbalah and in Christianity, the 7 deadly sins and the 7 virtues, the 7 last words of Christ. And I thought, well, maybe I can stitch all of this together somehow. And I happened to remember the koan from Muman Khan of Uman asking his monks, "The world is vast and wide. Why do you put on your 7-piece robe at the sound of the bell?" So the 7-piece robe, in case you're wondering, is this thing. It's the kesa, or you're wearing a smaller version of it, the raksu. Why do you put on your raksu at the sound of the bell? Why do you put on your kesa at the sound of the bell? And so I decided to make a 7-piece robe out of various stories. And that also made me think of the role of story, the role of myth in religion and in life in general. You know, some people, and I was one of them, was attracted originally to Zen by what I thought was an absence of myth. I thought, this is just straight ahead, no nonsense, none of this religious mumbo jumbo. Little did I know. And you know, it was my naivete. I was very young. I was 22 when I first came to the monastery, and I had kind of a scientific bent. I, eventually, after I left the monastery, went to medical school and became a physician. So I have this kind of very evidence-based approach to the world. But as I've matured and have come to see how the world actually functions, I realize that myth is just a subset of delusion, and delusion is just a subset of reality. You can't really tease out these belief systems from our perception of reality. They're so intimately woven in. A perfect example of that is money. You know, what is money? It's a currency of exchange which didn't exist more than a few thousand years ago. And it has enabled all kinds of societal conventions, societal growth, business growth, commerce growth. The entire modern world runs on this delusion that this thing called money has value. And every so often something happens that knocks the heck out of that delusion. You know, a depression happens. And suddenly prices which we thought were going in one direction only go in the opposite direction, and everything is cheap. Nothing has the value that it used to have. And if you happen to have investments, those investments may be completely worthless, because it's just an agreed upon myth that we have, that this substance has an intrinsic value. And that delusion has been manipulated by the tech savvy to create something called Bitcoin, which is a digital currency that has no reference whatsoever in the real world. None. There's no physical exchange happening. It's all numbers and digits in computers. And the last time I looked, one Bitcoin was worth approximately $100,000. So this is a fantasy created by tech geniuses to make themselves incredibly wealthy and to give themselves almost unlimited power. The Republican campaign was largely funded by Bitcoin and the founders of Bitcoin. So this is a myth, and yet it is a myth which has very, very real consequences in the world. Delusions are the fuel on which society functions. Our economy, which is the envy of the world, is the envy of the world because we have more of this fantasy money than anybody else, and we consume more tangible goods as a result of that than anybody else, and everybody wants to sell us their tangible goods. So delusion and myth are not something that is easily teased out from the structure of the world or the structure of our lives. They are very real, even though we call them delusions. They have very real consequences, very real effects. Dogen, in his Genjo Koan, when he was talking about delusion, he said, "To carry the self forward and illuminate myriad things is delusion. That myriad things come forth and illuminate the self is awakening. Those who have great realization of delusion are Buddhas. Those who are greatly deluded about realization are sentient beings." If you have not read Dogen's Genjo Koan, I would recommend that as a text that is worth reading and pondering and meditating on. To carry the self forward and illuminate myriad things is delusion. That myriad things come forth and illuminate the self is awakening. Those who have great realization of delusion are Buddhas. Those who are greatly deluded about realization are sentient beings. So we think that somehow in our practice we are going to conquer delusion. We're going to put delusion aside, and we're going to be realized. And Dogen is saying, wait a second. The Buddha is the one who has great realization about delusion. He knows how delusion functions. That doesn't mean that it no longer functions. It doesn't mean that you can just ignore it. But you have to understand it. You have to put it in its place. So this 7-piece robe that I put together talks a lot about Shakyamuni Buddha and about practice and about life and death. So let's start with the first piece. Siddhartha Gautama emerged from his mother's side as she stood leaning against a tree in a painless and pure birth. He took 7 steps to the north, 7 steps to the south, 7 steps to the east, and 7 steps to the west, and a lotus flower sprang up in each of his footsteps. Pointing one hand to heaven and the other to the earth, he exclaimed, "I alone am the world-honored one." A wise man, hearing about this, predicted, "That boy's got quite a future." The wise man was the court astrologer. Buddha's Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama's father was a king. Siddhartha was a prince. And so, of course, as any good king had in those days, he had an astrologer who opined on all sorts of things. And when Buddha was born, he predicted and told the king that he would either become a great world leader, a great king, or a great spiritual teacher and sage. And Siddhartha's father was very happy about the first half of the prediction and not so happy about the second half. So this is a really nice example of myth. Everybody agrees that there was somebody who was born in approximately 563 BCE. So approximately 2,600 years ago, a little bit less. But all of the elements of the story are myth. The story is that his mother conceived after having a dream of a white elephant entering her right side carrying a white lotus flower. And when she was ready for birth, she was out walking in her garden and leaned against a tree and reached up, and Buddha just sort of fell from her armpit. So, I don't know, does this story remind you in any way of the Christian story of the virgin birth? Right? No sex involved. Mary apparently didn't have sex but had a baby. And it's not really gone into much detail, but I think she had the baby the normal way, not out the side. So this story does that one better. Not only is there no sex involved, but nothing passes through the vaginal canal at all. It's just, there we go. You know, and this says a lot about, it says a lot about who they wanted this person to be. They being the early Buddhists who made up these myths. Somebody who was, from the very beginning, different from all other men and women. All us poor schnooks that were the result of carnal acts. This was somebody else, just no carnality at all. And the story of his coming out, and as soon as he was born, taking 7 steps in all of the 4 cardinal directions, which, by the way, if you take 7 steps in all the 4 cardinal directions, you end up in exactly the same spot. So he essentially didn't move. And reaches up and down. I alone am the world-honored one. Which is, in a different way, exactly what every baby says when it's born. Just, "Ah! Pay attention to me." But it's a really nice story. It's a wonderful story, and in the Holy Days session we get to bathe the baby Buddha, and it's a really, it's a wonderful way of honoring the miracle of birth. And birth is a miracle not because baby Buddha was born without sex or without a dirty, bloody vaginal delivery, which, by the way, I don't know how many people here have given birth or watched a birth, but it's a really disgusting process. I mean, it is a mess, just the messiest thing you can imagine. There's a lot of screaming, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of bleeding, there's a lot of fluids, It's, it was not my favorite rotation in medical school. Let's just put it that way. But it's a miracle. It's a really messy miracle. So this is the first piece in the 7-piece robe. The miracle of birth. And now, the next piece, the second piece, 7 days after Buddha was born, his mother, Queen Maya, died. That piece in itself convinces me that there's more than a shred of truth in the mythology around Buddha's life. Because this is not a detail that any good storyteller would put in. There's the Christian story of the virgin birth, and then Mary is there raising Jesus, and even there when he dies. But to have your mother die when you're only 7 days old, but Siddhartha was too young to know what was going on. So, even though he had this tragedy in his life, he was still sheltered. Because what happens that we're not aware of is not a tragedy. It's only a tragedy when we become aware. And Siddhartha's father shielded him from all of the difficult and painful aspects of life. So that when he was grown and of an age where he could fully understand and appreciate the human condition, he was introduced to disease and old age and death. And having been sheltered, he was so shaken by it that he had a great doubt about life and the meaning of life. What was the point? There must be some way past this suffering, this grief. And so he was married at a young age, had a child, but this doubt kept growing in him. This painful searching. Until when he was just under 30, he decided to leave his home. So you have to imagine that in most ways, to all outward appearances, he is a failure. He's failed as a prince. He is not going to become a great king, as the astrologer predicted. He's failed as a husband. He deserts his wife. He's failed as a father. He leaves his young son. But he is true to himself, regardless of how he may appear, whatever failures he has. He is true to himself. Which leads us to our third piece. Siddhartha sat under the Bodhi tree for 7 days and 7 nights without moving. On the morning of the 8th day, he saw the morning star, and all his striving ceased. No longer Siddhartha, now Shakyamuni Buddha. He exclaimed, "How wonderful! I and all beings together are fully awakened." So this is another myth. Nobody knows really what went on under that Bodhi tree. He may have been there a day. He may have been there a week. He may have been there 2 weeks. The details are not what matter. It makes a great story, and it fulfills the numerological significance of the number 7. He was there for 7 days and 7 nights. The numerological significance of 7, completion, perfection, spiritual attainment. There's a reason why we do 7-day sessions. There's a reason why the Judeo-Christian tradition says that the world was created in 6 days, and on the 7th day, God rested. "7 days, 7 nights. that we think of as one day. But even to say that it's one day is really a misstatement. It was one moment in time. And this is why I say that it doesn't really matter how long he was sitting under that tree. He was in such a deep state of meditative absorption, of samadhi, that it could have been 1,000 years. And it would have been all the same to him. He wasn't paying attention to the sun going around, the moon rising. He was fully absorbed. He was in such a condition of pure absorption that when he saw the morning star, it was as if the universe had just been created. He was coming from nowhere into this universe. And at that moment, he saw that there was nothing that he had to strive for. All of his strivings, all of his doubts, all of his searching was just put to rest in a moment of pure wonder. And nobody knows what he said when that happened. The myth is a beautiful myth that he said, "How wonderful. I and all sentient beings together are fully awakened." He might have just said, "Wow. Which is just another way of saying, I and all beings are fully awakened. So, in our first three pieces, we have birth, we have death, we have going beyond birth and death. The fourth piece. For 7 weeks after his awakening, Buddha continued to meditate under the Bodhi tree until he had a vision of Brahma Sahampati, king of the Brahma gods, who told him to get off his butt and teach. He met 5 of his old ascetic friends in Deer Park near Varanasi and delivered his first sermon, describing the Four Noble Truths in the Middle Way. They each became disciples, and one of them, Kandana, was enlightened just by hearing him speak. So that was another way in which Buddha was a failure. He was an ascetic. And he was, for 6 years after he left his wife and child and wandered, he studied with various meditation teachers and he became an ascetic. He became such a serious ascetic that he nearly starved to death. And he realized how futile that was. So he was a failure as an ascetic too. Just one failure after another. And Fortunately, when he almost starved to death, somebody took mercy on him and gave him some rice milk. And he revived and developed the idea that maybe starving to death is not a good idea, which I'm very glad that he came up with, because I like eating. So here he begins his teaching career. Notice here again the number 7, 7 weeks. Now, nobody really knows how long he meditated under the tree before he decided that he needed to go out into the world. And nobody really knows if he had this vision of one of the Brahmin gods, the king of the Brahmin gods, telling him, yeah, you know, it'd be a good idea to go out into the world. Don't just sit here. Do something. Jigan Roshi was mentioning the koan about the 100-foot pole and proceeding on from the 100-foot pole. The Brahmin god was there saying, proceed on from the 100-foot pole. You know, you may have attained something, but what good is it? What good is it? What, is it going to die with you? Go on, do something. Notice here the 7 weeks. This is coming up to the next piece of the 7-piece robe. The 5th piece, 7 days in a week, 7 weeks in the cycle of transition after death. In the Buddhist tradition, it's thought that the transition from one life to the next takes 7 weeks, 7 times 7 days. And this is what Buddha did, sitting under the Bodhi tree. Siddhartha was dead. Buddha was being born. So 7-day transition, 7-week transition, 49 days. During this transition in the Zen tradition, we chant Daisagaki, and there are various ceremonies that are held. And it's a way of easing the grief of the people who have lost loved ones, and a way of aiding the transition of the departed. So Buddha completed his 7 weeks of transition meditating before he began his new life. The 6th piece. Fall 7 times, get up 8. And somebody who speaks Japanese can correct my pronunciation. Nanakarobi Yaoki? Yes. That's okay? Yeah. Okay. So that's an old Japanese saying. And this is what we all do. It's certainly what Buddha did. You know, he failed as a father, he failed as a husband, he failed as an ascetic. Every one of us has failures in our life. Things that we wanted to do, things that others wanted us to do, disappointing our parents, disappointing our loved ones, our spouses, disappointing ourselves. Every society has failures, times when they act in barbarous ways, horrible ways, when the mythology and delusion runs counter to basic humanity. But how we bounce back from these times is so important, that we keep moving forward, no matter how many times we fall down. It's an old Japanese saying, and if you look at the history of Japan, they had tremendous upheaval in the medieval age. They had a very rough and in some ways humiliating introduction into the modern world at the hands of the United States, who wanted to trade with them and wouldn't take no for an answer, and so sent their fleet into Tokyo Harbor in the 1850s. And this dragged them kicking and screaming into the 19th century. And soon they had adopted the modern technology that was introduced to them so successfully that they then started a war with Russia and defeated them, which was the first time since Genghis Khan probably that an Eastern power defeated a Western power. And then, of course, the misadventure of the Second World War, which completely knocked the society for a loop, completely revolutionized the society. The Second World War culminating with the disaster of the atomic bombs and with the country in horrible shambles, just completely devastated. Jikyo was talking yesterday about the history of Nyogen Senzaki and Soen Roshi and Edo Roshi. Edo Roshi was a young man, adolescent, during the time of the Second World War. Actually, the Second World War, we think of it as starting in 1942, because that was when our involvement started, December 1941, and then we really started in 1942. But the Second World War for Japan started much earlier, in the early 1930s, with the invasion of China. And so they were at war for well over a decade. The society was completely militaristic. Talk about mythology and delusion. And when the forces were defeated and the emperor, for the first time, was heard to speak in public, it came as such a shock, completely knocking dead so many of the myths that this society was based on. And they were devastated, but rose up again. And out of the tragedy and horror of the Second World War, Zen came to the United States. From disaster and devastation, always something new comes. It's painful while we go through it, but something new comes, something potentially better, potentially kinder and more fair. And although I'm speaking of Japan, we can use the same analogy for our own country and any other country, and in our own lives and in our own families. Failure is not the end. Failure is just the beginning and the prerequisite. So however many times you may feel that you fail in your life or in your Zen practice, it's not a failure. It's just the process. And now the final piece of the 7-piece robe. Uman said, "The world is vast and wide. Why do you put on your 7-piece robe at the sound of the bell?" So I probably should say a few words about Uman, although I think he's well known to most of the people here. He was a teacher in the Song dynasty in China, a bit later than Rinzai. Rinzai died in 867. Uman was born in 864, so the next generation after Rinzai. And he was known for his eloquence, but not eloquence in the sense of giving great speeches. Eloquence in the sense of being able to put realization into words and actions that could speak volumes in just one word or a few words. One of the most famous koans involving Uman was, "What is Buddha? A shit-wiping stick. Use toilet paper." Uman, when he was dying, called his monks together and addressed the assembly. And the last thing that he said was, "Coming and going is continuous. I must be on my way. and then he died, sitting in the full lotus posture. After he died, his body didn't decompose. He was sealed in a room, and nobody opened the room for several years. And when they opened it, he was still there sitting in full lotus posture, and nothing had changed. He was just dead, but no decomposition. His body, which I suppose eventually mummified, was revered as a relic for the next 1,000 years, and was only destroyed in the 20th century by the Red Guard, the communists who were fiercely anti-religious. And so anything which was smacking of tradition had to go. Anything which smacked of religion had to go. And so this 1,000-year relic of Uman's corpse was destroyed and burned. So Uman said, the world is vast and wide. You have freedom. There are so many things you could be doing. What would you be doing now if you were at home? Having dinner, maybe going to a movie, maybe being with a loved one, playing with your kids, or playing with your dog. The world is vast and wide, so many possibilities. What are you doing here? Really? What are you doing here? But this is part of our delusion, is that we think that we have so many possibilities. This is part of the myth, and it's especially, Uman lived over 1,000 years ago, but if it was true in his day, my God, it's true now. I mean, in this consumer culture, you can hop on a jet plane and be in Paris in 5 hours, 6 hours. You can go anywhere in your SUV, which has automatic steering that, you don't even have to pay attention to the road. You can be in the back seat as your car drives itself, having a drink. The world is vast and wide. But this is our delusion. We can't be doing anything but what we're doing. And if you're unhappy doing what you're doing because there are all kinds of other things you think you could be doing, you're really screwing yourself. Right now, there's only one thing you can be doing. To think that you have a choice is setting yourself up. There's an expression in today FOMO, fear of missing out. Fear of missing out is, I've noticed this in younger people, they don't like to make plans because they always think that something is going to come up at the last minute that's going to be better. And if they commit to something, then they're going to miss out on this other opportunity, which is the exact opposite of freedom. Freedom is committing. Freedom is being where you are, doing what you're doing, being exactly where you are, exactly here, exactly now, and not thinking there's something better that I could be doing if I wasn't doing this. That's a way of poisoning yourself. There's an essay, a rather longish essay, by the French philosopher Albert Camus, called The Myth of Sisyphus, which I read when I was quite young and really didn't understand. Like a lot of stuff that I read when I was young. Just really, I didn't have the life experience to know what he was talking about. So for anybody who has not read the essay and doesn't know the myth of Sisyphus, doesn't know who Sisyphus was in Greek mythology, he was a king and a trickster. He was very tricky. He was always playing tricks on people, and he managed somehow to play a trick on death. And he was so successful at playing this trick on death that he arranged it so he would never have to die. And the gods didn't take kindly to that. They didn't like that. So as a punishment for being so tricky and embarrassing death, Sisyphus was condemned to roll a heavy boulder up a mountain. And just as he was about to get to the top of the mountain, the boulder would roll back down to the bottom of the mountain. And since Sisyphus couldn't die, that meant that this was eternal punishment. Now, Camus wrote this during the Nazi occupation of Paris. It was a very tough time to be alive. He was very involved in the resistance. I imagine that he saw many of his friends captured, killed. And he wrote this as a way of explaining the absurd position that human beings find themselves in. of having to do seemingly impossible tasks, persevering in hopeless situations. But you could take this into almost any realm. You could talk about the office worker who has to go to the same boring job day after day after day. Or the Zen student who has to go to the Zendo day after day, sit after sit, even though their knees are killing them. And they still can't figure out the damn koan. Or a mother taking care of a child. Perhaps taking care of a special needs child. Or an adult child taking care of an aged and infirm parent. We each have some task in our life that seems as heavy and immovable as that boulder that Sisyphus had to roll up the hill. But Camus says freedom is learning to find joy in life despite or even because of whatever you're involved in. You know, in our meal chant we say, having finished the morning meal, let us pray that all beings may accomplish whatever tasks they are engaged in and be fulfilled with all the Buddha Dharmas. That task, those tasks that all beings are engaged in, could include rolling a rock up the hill, or finding yourself in a seemingly hopeless situation, or finding yourself in just doing the same thing over and over and over again. The world is vast and wide. Why do you put on your 7-piece robe at the sound of the bell? Camus says, Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. In each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of this mountain full of night alone forms a world. The struggle itself to the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. The difference between the words have to and get to is what changes the meaning. I have to be here. I have to go to the Zendo. I get to go to the Zendo. I get to sit. I get to be here. Right here. Right now. Because that's the only place that awakening happens. Right here, right now. Wherever you are. That's the only place that you can wake up. And whether that's sitting in the Zendo, or rolling a rock up a hill, or going to work in the morning, or taking care of an infant, or taking care of an infirm parent, the only place you get to be compassionate, kind, loving, so this is the 7-piece robe. The 7-piece robe now is rather fancy. But back in the Buddha's day and the early days of Buddhism, they would stitch them together from rags. Rags that were discarded as being too foul to use for any other purpose. Sometimes the rags were used to clean the body of the dead or other unsavory practices. They were discarded. And the Buddhists would take them and wash them and stitch them together to make a 7-piece robe. And the robe, Rohatsu, our kesa, links us to that history, the history of the Buddha. Links us to the Sangha, to the community. And our lives are like that 7-piece robe. They're stitched together by all of these disparate moments: birth, death, failure, falling down, getting up. Going to perform tasks over and over and over again. And waking up. So that's the number 7.